Hello and welcome to another Seth book analysis video. I am Poetic Heretic and we are continuing with The Unknown Reality, Volume 2, a Seth book by Jane Roberts, and giving our analysis of it, or giving my analysis of it. As usual, I'll ask people to remember that this is not just my sitting here simply reading the book the entire time. It's an analysis. I will be stopping occasionally to comment on various things as they strike me, and it's also not just our sitting here believing it the entire time or blindly believing everything that is in this book or any book the entire time. My strongest encouragement is critical thinking. You should question everything, including everything I say, or at least that is my suggestion to you. So, with all of that said, without further ado, let us begin. Session 723, December 2nd, 1974, 9:42 p.m., Monday. Good evening. Good evening, Seth. Dictation. Your worldview is your personalized interpretation of the physical universe. Your home station does not simply present programming for you to view. Footnote. Seth began his home station and worldview discussions in sessions 711 and 718, respectively. End of footnote. Instead, you help create the program, of course, even while you are a part of it. On any given afternoon, certain elements of experience will be quote-unquote given, roughly sketched in. There are certain cues to set the stage, It may be a snowy, humid, or dry and sunny day, for instance. The location may be city or town, yet within that loose framework you create the program of the day according to your own worldview. If that view is expansive, then you have far greater leeway in creating your experience. You can add greater depth, so to speak, to the characterization. You can, in other words, take advantage of the unknown reality by letting it add to your home station. In the dream state, you range beyond your waking world view. You are able to bring into focus other interests and activities. These can remain in the background during waking life, or you can decide to enlarge your worldview by taking advantage of your dreaming activities. Many of the exercises given here are geared in that direction. You are not alone in physical reality, so obviously your picture of the world is also affected by the worldview of others, and you play a part in underlined their experiences. There is a constant waking give and take. The same give and take occurs in the dream state, however. You affect your worldview through your dreams. Correction. You affect your world through your dreams, then, as much as you do through your waking activities. In terms of time, lapses had to occur as various species physically matured and developed. They did so in response to inner impetus. The many languages that are now known originated in what you can call, from your point of view, non-waking reality. Words, again, are related to the neurological structure, and languages follow that pattern. In the dream state, many kinds of communication occur, and there are inner translations. Two people with different languages can speak together quite clearly in certain dreams, and understand each other perfectly. They may each translate the communication into their familiar language. Underneath this, however, there are basic inner sounds upon which all language is based, in which certain images give forth their own sound, and the two together portray clear, precise meaning. Footnote. In Chapter 5 of Personal Reality, Sessions 623 through 25 all contain Seth material on inner sound, light, and electromagnetic structures of the body that, ordinarily, we do not perceive. From the 624th session, for example, quote, I told you that thoughts are translated into this inner sound, but thoughts always attempt to materialize themselves also. As such, they are incipient images, collectors of energy. End quote. End of footnote. A long time ago, I said that language would be impossible were it not for its basics in telepathic communication, and that communication is built up of microscopic images and sounds. Footnote. Seth could be referring to his remark in the 34th session for March 11, 1964, quote, "Telepathic communications go on continually beneath consciousness, and without the aid of telepathy and of the inner senses, language itself would be meaningless. The hidden cues are the symbols that make language intelligible." End quote. End of footnote. These are translated into different languages. Consciously, then, your worldview is affected by the language of your culture or country. Certain sounds, inflections, and expressions, taken together, have a more or less precise meaning. The meaning is usually quite specific and often directional. Words in a language function not only by defining what a specific object is, for example, but also by defining what it is not. Footnote. This material reminds me of Seth in the 681st session in Volume 1. Quote, "The deeper explanations, however, in this case of probabilities, demand a further expansion of ideas of consciousness. It is not so much a matter of Rupert's vocabulary, incidentally, since even a specialized scientific one would only present these ideas in its own distorted fashion. It is more a problem of basic language itself. As you are acquainted with it, words do not exist, for example, for some of the ideas I hope to convey. We will at any rate begin." End quote. And then this footnote continues. In conventional linear evolutionary terms, many theories have been advanced throughout history to explain the origins of speech. Prior to the 17th century, extensive searches and studies were made for a quote-unquote natural or Adamic language, a basic form of human communication that was supposed to underlie all racial languages. No such universal proto-language was ever isolated. As science now reaches back into human beginnings, the already scanty evidence gradually disappears, until finally it seems highly unlikely that the species will ever really know how or when its language and or speech started. Present linguistic thinking assigns the burgeoning of a quote-unquote modern language ability to late Neanderthal man, who existed across southern Europe and other lands in the eastern hemisphere during part of the last Ice Age glaciation, from about 70,000 to 10,000 years ago. Some 40,000 years ago, in Europe at least, Neanderthal man either evolved into or was supplanted by Cro-Magnon man, Homo sapiens sapiens, our immediate predecessor. Numerous forms of vocal communication, whether quote-unquote true speech or not, in current opinion, undoubtedly existed among the ancestors of our species for many millennia before the appearance of late Neanderthal man, however. According to conservative estimates, such methods could have been in use for well over 2 million years, perhaps beginning even with our pre-human or animal stages. Jane and I find certain other research claims inconceivable, that in some of those earlier times verbal exchanges between members of the species, whether they be called pre-human or human, could have been a hindrance rather than an asset. To us, even the potential for audible communication has always been as much a part of our creature states as arms and legs. I'm only noting that such abilities represent one more means, upon a vast timescale, by which consciousness inexhaustibly seeks to know itself in this camouflage reality. Seth tells us, of course, that pre-human communication and human language and speech have originated in rhythmic patterns again and again, since in the far past our planet has seen the development of a number of presently unknown civilizations. See, for example, his material on reincarnational civilizations and the Lumanians in Chapter 15 of Seth Speaks. In Volume 1 of Unknown Reality, see his discussion on ancient man in the 702nd session, as well as Jane's own material on the quote, "innumerable species of man in the making," end quote, in Appendix 6. Certain presentations in Appendix 18 contain information from Seth about the distortive effects caused by words as he communicates through Jane. Review his excerpts from the 27th session for February 1964. Quote, "It is difficult for me to have to string out this material in words." End quote. End of footnote. (1005) To some extent in the dream state, you are freed of such cultural leanings. In the most effective of dreams, experience is actually more direct, in that it is less limited by language concepts. Waking, you generally become familiar with your thoughts through words that are mental, automatically translating your thoughts into language. Your thoughts therefore fall, or flow, into prefabricated forms. In the dream state, however, thoughts are often experienced directly, quote unquote, you live them out. You become what they are. They are projected instantly and in such a fashion. They escape the limitations that you often place upon them. That is why it is frequently difficult to remember your dreams in a verbal fashion, or squeeze them back into the expression of usual language. Period. Your language often purposely inhibits meaning. Give us a moment. To some extent, language underlined does make the unknown known and recognizable. It sets up signposts that each person in a culture recognizes. To do this, however, it latches upon certain significances and ignores others. You might know the word for rock, for instance. Knowing the word might actually prevent you from seeing any specific rock clearly as it is, or recognizing how it is different from all other rocks. Ooh, there is a comment I need to make on this, because now Seth is touching on something very interesting that I've actually, weirdly enough, been thinking about a little more often lately. Like, it just kind of pops into my mind, and that is the idea that, well, kind of as Seth is saying, language does so often inhibit our awareness of what things actually are, because using Seth's example of a rock, it's like you can look at a rock and think you know what it is. And Eckhart Tolle has talked about this, and he was just talking about it in a recent video he put up, which is also a weird coincidence. Like, right before I filmed this, he mentioned this in a video. So I'm not claiming this idea as my own. But you can look at a rock and say, oh, of course I know what that is. That's a rock. But it's not a rock. It's whatever it is, Rock is a word. The actual thing itself is whatever it is. And so by mentally labeling it a rock, you're not actually experiencing the essence of it as much, or it's automatically like predisposing you to seeing the world more so, or maybe even exclusively, only in intellectual mental terms, as opposed to getting in touch with the essence of such things. It's like, say, you're looking at some plants. Like, I've got some plants in this room, some succulents, if we want to get even more specifically mental. And while yes, on the mental level, they are indeed succulents, they are indeed plants, what they really are is whatever they really are. They just are what they are. Plant or succulent is just a word, just a mental label that we humans are assigning to this unique and interesting being, or whatever you want to call it, that we're looking at in that instance, And so I would suggest to those watching, try this out with yourself sometime. Next time you're looking at, especially if it's something that we would typically consider alive. I know many people say, well, everything's alive, but if it's like a plant or an animal, rather than thinking, oh, this is this kind of plant, or thinking like, I don't know, say it's like a bird, rather than thinking of a bird, just think, okay, that's just a word that we're assigning to this, and then try to really like look at it as if you never heard of what that was, if that makes sense. Like, look at the plant like you didn't even know what a plant was, or never even come across the concept of a plant. Look at the bird or the animal like you've never even come across the concept of that animal. And then you start to really see or feel into more the essence of things, and it's a very enriching experience. At least for me it is. Also, I'm just going to make sure that we're still recording properly here. Yes, we are. Would hate to get to the end of this and discover that I have to do it all over again because it wasn't actually recording, but we are recording. I feel like there was one more thing I was going to say. What was it? Oh, just that. Yeah, I don't know if this is the point that's the specific point that Seth is wanting to make here, or maybe he's going to go on to make it. But that can be one of the great disadvantages of language, I think, is it, and so many people don't realize this, is it's literally a mental thing. It trains us to perceive the world in mental terms. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with that, but it's certainly robbing us of the richness of life when we begin to only see things in those terms rather than getting in touch with the actual essence of things by not giving them a mental label. So I hope that makes sense, because it's incredibly, like I said, enriching if you can understand that concept of removing concepts. Anyway. The play of sunlight or shadow upon any given rock may utterly escape you. Footnote. As an artist, I'm so used to observing our physical world in terms of forms, colors, shadows, shapes, and quote-unquote negative shapes, the patterns formed by areas between and around shadows or objects, that I sometimes have to remind myself of the obvious, that each individual in the world perceives it from his or her own viewpoint. How strange, I found myself thinking, that Joe, say, doesn't see our environment in artistic terms, since what I see is so plain to me. But then, I tell myself, Joe has a method of cognition that's quite natural to him. If he loves flowers, for instance, he may enjoy more of a sheer emotional reaction through the appreciation of a rose than I can. End of footnote. You will simply pass it by under the category of rock. In the dream state, you might find yourself sleeping on a sun-warmed rock, or climbing on icy ones. You might feel yourself encased in a rock, with your consciousness dispersed. You might have any number of different experiences involving rocks, all quite liberating. After such an experience, you might look at rocks in an entirely different fashion, and see them in ways that escape your language. Rocks give forth sounds that you do not hear, for example, yet your language automatically limits your perception of what any rock is. To some extent, words come between you and your direct expression. They should and can express that experience instead. Take your break. 10:22. Jane said her trance hadn't been good. Quote, I was inhibited by all kinds of things, noises mostly. I hope they didn't make me interfere with the material. Was there more noise than usual? End quote. She has excellent hearing, so if her trance hadn't been as deep as usual for whatever reasons, then even ordinary sounds might disrupt her. I told Jane that Seth's information was as penetrating as ever. I also reminded her that the house was actually quieter than it usually is. A wet snow had started after supper, and we'd shut our windows, thus cutting down on the rumble and clatter of automobile traffic. Seth's remarks about inner sounds were quite interesting in view of an episode that had taken place 10 minutes or so before the session started. As we made ready for it in our living room, Jane became aware of a faint buzzing, a sound I couldn't hear. She repeatedly exclaimed over this noise until, investigating, we located its source high up in a far corner, a small insect moving among the leaves of our philodendron vines. We've encouraged the plants to grow up a set of poles that reach from the top of a bookcase to the ceiling. The whole structure serves as a modest room divider, shielding the living room from the hall entrance to the apartment. Well, I think it's going to be a short session, she finally laughed. I feel restless, like going for a walk in the snow or something. But the session hardly proved to be a short one. In connection with the practice element that Seth gives below, plus the following 2 paragraphs of related information, I'd like the reader to refer to chapters 7 and 8 in Jane's Adventures in Consciousness. In them, she discussed the development of her Samari quote-unquote language. Resume at 10:43. Practice element 17. Part of the unknown reality, then, is hidden beneath language and the enforced pattern of accustomed words. So, for an exercise, look about your environment. Make up new, different quote-unquote words for the objects that you see about you. Pick up any object, for example, hold it for a few seconds, feel its texture, look at its color, and spontaneously give it a new name by uttering the sounds that come into your mind. See how the sounds bring out certain aspects of the object that you may not have noticed before. The new word will fit as much as the old one did. It may, in fact, fit better. Do this with many objects, following the same procedure. You can instead say the name of any object backwards. Footnote. Reading backward is something I've casually indulged in for many years. I don't think those actions inspired Seth's advice here, although my unconscious motivations for such a practice may coincide with it. I developed the habit as a teenager, reading signs and automobile license plates aloud and backward when my father would take my mother, my two younger brothers, and myself for Sunday rides in his 1932 Chevrolet. I found it to be great fun. I also taught myself to read upside-down print, an equally fascinating endeavor. In later years, working with others on a daily basis, I'd occasionally talk backward in a joking manner. Ekkel sit. In other words, like this. It's spelled out. I don't know how I should say that in recording this video, but it's literally like this, only spelled backwards. Ekkel sit. The interesting thing here was that after a while, my coworkers not only came to understand what I was saying, but joined in the game. End of footnote. In such ways, you break up to some extent the automatic patterning of familiar phrases, so that you can perceive the individuality that is within each object. To get in direct contact with your own feelings as they are, again make up your own spontaneous sounds sometimes. Your emotions often cannot be expressed clearly in terms of language, and such underlined patterning can allow them to flow freely. The freshness of dream experience lies in its direct nature. Your cultural worldview does not have any clear understanding of the nature of dreams, so that their direct, clear expression is not recalled often in the morning. At night you tune into dreaming reality simply by closing out so-called waking reality, but the same kind of dream experience continues beneath your focus in waking life. Dreaming, you are still aware of your daily experience, but it is seemingly peripheral. Waking, your dream experience is peripheral also, but you are less aware of that condition. Both together represent the dimensions of your consciousness, and they exist simultaneously. You can and often do work out in dreams the challenges of daily life. In waking life, you are also working out challenges set for yourselves in the dream state. Obviously, then, your consciousness is equipped to function in the known and unknown realities, and the divisions that you have set up are quite arbitrary. Pause at 11:01. You may understand that many of your dreams have a symbolic meaning. It may escape you, however, that the objects with which you surround yourself in physical life also have symbolic meanings, only these are three-dimensional. You may spend time trying to understand the nature of dreams and their implications, without ever realizing that your physical life is to some extent a three-dimensional dream. It will faithfully mirror your dream images at any given time. Your physical life and your dreaming life are so intimately connected that it can be misleading to say what I am about to say, that waking experience springs from the unknown dream reality. On the one hand, the statement is indeed true. On the other hand, the intricate inner workings make it impossible to separate one from the other. Quote-unquote reality operates basically, however, in a way that is perceived more clearly in the dream state. Freedom from time and place, the wider kind of communication, the great mobility of consciousness, all of these experiences under dreaming conditions are characteristic of the basic nature of reality, whereas your waking experience provides limitations that are indicators of certain conditions only. Period. To some extent, the greater expression of consciousness can be experienced under usual waking conditions, but only when a personality is flexible enough and underlined secure enough to alter the focus of consciousness. This way, other unperceived data become available. The unknown reality is not beyond your experience, therefore. Any of your scientific or religious disciplines could benefit from a study of the dreaming consciousness, for there the basic nature of reality exists as clearly as you can perceive it. The inner condition of dreaming is valid. You find yourselves in other times and places because basically neither time nor space exists as you suppose. Footnote. Seth has said all of this in various ways before, of course, since he began coming through Jane almost exactly 11 years ago. Yet to my mind, the 4 paragraphs just given contain some of his most important material in the 2 volumes of Unknown Reality. Certainly it buttresses any of his dream information in Volume 1. End of footnote. Buttresses, that's not a word I'm used to saying. There are no basic dangers involved in alterations of consciousness without drugs, but artificial dangers can occur because of your cultural beliefs. These result because such individuals find themselves with no acceptable framework in which to correlate or understand their experiences. They try to fall back upon religious or scientific or pseudoscientific explanations. Footnote. Seth's material here can apply to the quote-unquote case histories Jane described in chapters 15 and 16 of Adventures. End of footnote. In a way, the one-line kind of consciousness that you have developed can be correlated with your use of any one language. Experience is programmed, highly specialized, and attains a seemingly tight organization only underlined because, intently, it limits so much of reality. In those terms, if you are bilingual, you are somewhat better off, for your thoughts have a choice of 2 paths. Biologically, you are physically capable of speaking any language now in use on the face of the earth. You would consider it an achievement if you learned to speak many languages. You would not find it frightening or unnatural, though you would take it for granted that some training was involved. In the same way, your one-line kind of consciousness is but one of many quote-unquote languages. The others are as native, as natural, as biologically feasible. (1118) Rupert has been involved with what he calls the Samari Language, as referred to in the notes at break. This is an expression of the consciousness at a different focus. It is the native expression of a kind of experience that happens just outside of your official one-line focus of consciousness. First of all, it breaks up verbal patterning. Footnote. Jane first came through with Samari in her ESP class for November 23, 1971. Seth then devoted portions of the next 5 sessions to that development. From the 600th for December 13th. Quote, each symbol in an alphabet stands for unutterable symbols beneath it. Sound itself, even without recognizable words, carries meaning. Oddly enough, sometimes the given meaning of the word does battle with the psychic and physical meaning of the underlined sounds that compose it. The Samari word Shambhalina connotes the changing faces that the inner self adopts through its various experiences. Now this is a word that hints of relationships for which you have no word. End quote. And from the 602nd for January 5th, 1972, quote, in your language there are words that underlined sound like the reality they try to represent. These are called onomatopoeia in English. Hush is an example. End quote. I recommend a rereading of Chapter 8 for Adventures in connection with the material in this note. End of footnote. It is composed, however, of sounds and syllables Rupert has heard before, made up of jumbled Romance languages. Footnote. Such languages would be Italian, Spanish, French, and others stemming from Vulgar Latin. End of footnote. These are quote-unquote foreign as far as he is concerned. At the same time, those sounds are, in your terms, filled with the implications of antiquity, and bring up connotations of the species and of the psyche's past. Pause. They alter the usual physical response to meaningful sound. You may not realize it, but your language actually structures your underlined visual perception of objects. Samari breaks down the usual patterning, therefore, but it also releases the nervous system from its structured response to any particular stimulus. Wait, so what exactly is Seth saying here? You may not realize it, but your language actually structures your visual perception of objects. Samari breaks down the usual patterning, therefore, but it also releases the nervous system from its structured response to any particular stimulus. That is fascinating. I've often had the experience where if I just focus on a word and try to feel for it, I can actually sort of sense colors that feel like they're naturally associated with certain words, which is interesting in and of itself, I guess, but that's just what that reminded me of. The sounds, however, while spontaneous, are not unstructured. They will present a sound equivalent of the emotion or object perceived, an equivalent that is very direct and immediate, and that bears legitimate correspondence with the object or emotion. The fresh expression sets up a new kind of relationship between the so-called perceiver and the perceived. The Samari then becomes a bridge between two different kinds of consciousness, and returning to his usual state, Rupert can translate from the Samari to English. The English itself, however, then becomes charged, freshened with new concepts, carrying within a strangeness that itself alters the relationship of the words. This is a dream or trance language. It is as native to its level of consciousness as English is to your own, or Indian, or Chinese, or whatever. The various focuses of consciousness will have their own quote-unquote languages. Rupert has discovered that beneath the Samari there are deeper meanings. Footnote. In Chapter 8 of Adventures, Jane used her Samari poem, Song of the Pear Tree, to present some examples of such layered or deeper meanings. In one instance, she first translated the Samari line, Le lo terume, into the pear tree stands. Later she came to understand that a more literal and evocative meaning is, earth grows itself into a tree and becomes standing earth with pear faces. Wow, that is fascinating. Sometimes I want to comment on certain things, but I almost don't know what else to say about them, so I just say that is fascinating. He has become aware of what he calls long and short sounds. Some come so quickly that he cannot keep track, or speak them quickly enough. Others are so slow that he feels a sentence would take a week to utter. Footnote. See Appendix 19. End of footnote. These are the signatures of different focuses of consciousness as they are transposed in your space-time system. Pause at 1143. Languages express certain kinds of reality, usually by organizing experience verbally and mentally. In your case, again, a certain neurological prejudice occurs. If you experienced greater instances of out-of-body consciousness, for example, then your verbal expressions of underlined space and time would automatically change. If you became aware of more of your dreaming experience, your underlined language would automatically expand. Again, automatically, you would also become aware of other neurological patterns than those you use. Underlined these intently, activated, would then be picked up by your scientific instruments, and therefore change your ideas in such fields. Long pause. Many people find themselves singing gibberish when they are alone, and trying to free themselves from language structuring. Children often play by constructing their own languages, and speaking with tongues. Glossolalia is a beautiful... Wait, is that how you say that? Glossolalia, maybe. I don't know. Is a beautiful example of the attempt to express a reality that escapes the tyranny of overly structured words. I love how, as Seth is talking about language and words and the sounds of them affecting our perception of them and all this stuff, there's been like at least a couple of times so far this evening that when I've gone to read certain words, I have like messed them up. I've distorted them in some way. And since I tend to not really believe too much in coincidence, that's probably somehow fitting. Just further emphasizing Seth's points, I suppose. Music is a language. Painting is a language. The senses have a language of their own, one that seeps into structured words but dimly. Give us a moment. Other focuses of consciousness besides your own have different concepts of time, and are actually more biologically correct, in that they have greater knowledge of both cellular and spiritual realities. Other focuses of consciousness besides your own. I wonder what focuses of consciousness specifically Seth is referring to. There is nothing quote-unquote wrong with your present habitual kind of consciousness any more than there is anything wrong with speaking only one language. There is within you, however, the impetus to explore, to expand, to create, and that will automatically lead you to explore inner lands of consciousness as, in your terms, it has led you to explore the other countries of the physical world. Louder at 11:56. End of a very good session. Okay. A small word to Rupert. He is altering his world view. Seth postponed ending the session to make some comments on Jane's changing attitudes toward her physical environment, added a few remarks about the drawings I'm doing for dialogues, then, in excellent humor, closed out the session at 12:01 a.m. Jane said her trance had been considerably deeper after break. Certainly her delivery had been infused with more energy, and that energy lingered, for she felt much better now. All right, that is indeed the end of that session. It's kind of funny also, as Seth is talking about these various things regarding language, because I was just thinking the other day, maybe even just yesterday, of how, it has been over a decade since I graduated from high school, and yet I still remember some of the Spanish that I learned, because I took 4 years of Spanish in high school, and I can still remember to this day how to say things in it. Let's see if I can think of some right now, just off the top of my head. Like basic phrases, like, what should I say? No, this is bad. Once I'm on the spot, it's like, I think. Of course, here we are reading a Seth book. If I could remember the word for reading, I could say I am reading El Libro Seth, a Seth book. Can't remember the word for reading, though. I don't know if someone was in a new town where they just bought a house and they couldn't find their house because they couldn't find their way around. And it was a Spanish-speaking place. They could say, Donde está mi casa? Where is my house? It's just like a random thing that came to mind. I think that's the right. Or would it be Donde es? I don't know. But anyway, let's just continue. See, yesterday I was remembering all kinds of particular phrases, but now that I'm actually making a video, like, they don't want to come to me because I'm on the spot, I guess. Oh well. Session 724, December 4th, 1974, 9:45 p.m., Wednesday. Yesterday afternoon, to my surprise, I had still another internal vision experience with a Roman counterpart self of mine in the 1st century AD. It was reminiscent of my 3 Romans of last October, yet perplexing too. For this time I saw a different Roman counterpart. See Appendix 22 for my own material on the event, plus Seth's comments about it in ESP class last night, plus a quite unusual quote-unquote confirmation offered by class member Sue Watkins. My Jamaica experience of November 16th is also referred to by another student. I'm getting all this stuff, Jane said at 9:43, as we waited for Seth to come through. But I can't verbalize it yet. It's like concepts that I have to unscramble. It's sort of frustrating. Strange. I'm getting images too, but not clearly. One of them is about a world theater, made up of a particular century. I think we're going to get some great new material. That's funny, she continued, rather surprised. It seems I can get the stuff either on my own or go the Seth route. Well, it's easier to let Seth do it, so I guess I'll light a cigarette and go into the session. Good evening. Good evening, Seth. This is not book dictation, in that it does not fit in with our section of exercises. You may, however, include portions of the session in Unknown Reality if you so choose. There are connections, of course. And of course, as we know here, Jane and Rob almost always choose to include anything that could be even possibly slightly related into the books that they are writing with Seth, or that Seth is writing through them, or whatever. And so here we go. Again, we come up against limited ideas of personhood. If I tell you that you are a part of a far greater personhood, then unfortunately you take this to mean that underlined you are less than you are by contrast. I am not referring here to you specifically, Joseph, any more than I am to any reader or class member. Pause. Each individual recognizes the existence of abilities or talents, leanings or propensities, that are largely unexpressed. In your system of reality, you must operate in time. To develop as an athlete, for example, great training is required that automatically focuses energy and activity, and hence usually precludes deep concentration to the same degree in a different area. Similarly, to be a musician or an artist or a writer takes effort and time, and automatically focuses attention in specified directions that bar the same kind of work in other fields. A person in time, then, can only do so much, and in your terms the great sources of the psyche are barely tapped in a given lifetime. That much is obvious. Earlier in this work, I hinted at the hypothetical existence of a truly fulfilled Earth person, with a hyphen, footnote. In Volume 1 of Unknown Reality, see the 683rd session just after 1011, Seth commented, "You rarely find a person who is a great intellect, a great athlete, and also a person of deep emotional and spiritual understanding, an ideal prototype of what it seems mankind could produce." End of footnote. All of the spiritual, mental, and biological abilities would be actualized to whatever extent possible. Each physical body, in its own way, now, following its own individual peculiarities, would develop whatever skills it chose and found comfortable. Bodily abilities, however, would be freely expressed so that one woman might be a great runner or a man excel at swimming. Physical endurance of the kind now considered extraordinary would be the norm. At the same time, all of the latent spiritual and mental qualities would be fulfilled in a like manner, so that all of the potentials of the species would find actualization in the most developed way in the experience of each individual. All aspects of the sciences and the arts would be explored. Pause at 10:02. Again, in the terms of one lifetime, such achievements are practically impossible. This does not mean that a different kind of education would not bring those ideals closer. It does mean that individuals underlined choose to develop certain portions of their abilities, and that such a choice often necessitates ignoring other talents. In its own way, the world at any given time is a unit of individuals with deep psychic and biological connections. Each of you take a hand at painting a combined world picture. Though each version is slightly different, and some appear strange within the whole context, still a world picture emerges at any given quote-unquote time. The people alive during any century are embarked upon certain overall challenges. These are the result of private challenges that can best be worked out within a certain kind of framework. Time, as you understand it, is utilized as a method of focus, a divider like a room divider, separating purposes instead of furniture. If you want a Victorian room, you do not plank it down in the middle of a Spanish arrangement. That's weird because I was just talking about learning Spanish years ago and remembering a little bit of it. That's just odd to me anyway. Instead, you set it aside and frame it with its own decor, as you might in a museum that has separate rooms designating life in past centuries. The rooms in the museum exist at once. You may have to walk down a long corridor, go in a particular room and out the same door, before you can get to the next adjoining room. The 18th century drawing room may be next to a 12th century chapel in this hypothetical museum, but you cannot move through one to the other. You have to go into the corridor first. Pause. It is difficult to try to explain the creativity of the psyche when, as a species, you have such set ideas about it, but I shall try. Physically, you multiply. If you have a child, underlined, you are not diminished. You are not less yourself. You accept parents and grandparents and see them as individuals, while you yourself are also you as an individual, and yet sprung from the same biological seeds. Those seeds form the physical races, which are all variations on a theme, or as Rupert would say, eccentricities of an ever-changing model. Footnote. See Chapter 3, among others, of Jane's Politics. Quote, models and beloved eccentrics, end quote, as well as Note 11 for the 721st session in this Volume 2. End of footnote. You accept the fact that there are biological connections in terms of family, country, and race, between yourselves and the other individuals on your planet. The species divides itself up, so to speak, and the members of the different races at any given time distribute themselves in the various lands and continents. You are used to making organizations. You say, this race is thus and so, and we can trace its history through the ages. Footnote. See Appendix 23. End of footnote. Or, that race initiated language. Generally speaking, you see certain races as having their own characteristics. When you do this, you often ignore other contradictory tendencies that are not as apparent. No one, however, feels less a person because of not being in a race by himself or herself. 10:22. Give us a moment. The children that spring from your loins are real. They have their own lives. They share a certain portion of your experience, but they use that experience as they choose. In your terms, you exist in physical life before your children do. Now, in other terms, your own greater personhood exists before you do in the same way. That greater personhood gives birth to many quote-unquote psychic children, who then become physical by being born into the races of men and women. Each of those children wants to develop its abilities in a particular manner, translating them into Earth experience in such a way that all other portions of the Earth are also benefited. Give us a moment. And give me a moment. The world, then, is indeed like a theater at any given time, but the play is not preordained or laid out. It is instead a spontaneous happening in which overall themes are accepted beforehand. Each quote-unquote greater personage takes several parts, or brings forth several psychic children, who spring to life as individual human beings. These psychic children have as much underlined say in their birth as you have in yours, physically speaking, and that is considerable. You choose ahead of time your environment and purposes. This greater personage then has earthly counterparts, each individual alive taking part in the vital human drama of any given century. Each learns from the others, and the counterparts fit together like mosaics, except that these mosaics are fully endowed with independence and free will. So the individuals alive upon the body of the earth at any given time fit together as beautifully as the cells do within your individual body at a particular time. Most emphatically, take your break, 10:36 to 11 o'clock. Now, I am not saying that the human personality is, quote, as significant as a cell, no more and no less, end quote. I am saying that in a way the people alive on the body of the earth have the same kind of relationship, one to the other, as the cells have one to the other. Psychically, you are made up of counterparts, as physically you come from various races. There are far more counterpart groupings than there are races, but then your definition of races is arbitrary, period. Counterparts can be better related to physical families, for you might well have 4 or 5 counterparts alive in one century, as you might have 4 or 5 family members spanning the same amount of time. Basically, however, counterparts deal with fulfillments and developments that transcend races or countries. Now remember, underlined, you are one Earth version of your own greater personage. You are utterly yourself. That greater identity, however, is intrinsically your own, but is the part that cannot be physically expressed. Your experiences are your own. Through you they become a part of the experience of the greater identity, but its reality also quote-unquote originally gave you your physical existence, as you gave your children physical life. Your children are not you, yet once they were contained within the mother's womb. Yet they did not originate from the womb either, but from the seed and the egg. Give us a moment. Your individual experience then becomes a part of your own greater personage, but at the same time you unconsciously draw upon the knowledge of that personage and use it for underlined your purposes. You become an offshoot, so to speak. You are unconsciously aware of the experiences of quote-unquote your counterparts, as they are of yours, and you use that information to round out your own. Period. Give us a moment. Certain abilities can be developed with much greater ease in particular time periods, in a highly industrialized technology, for example, and those interested in that kind of an environment did not generally appear in the eras of the cavemen, simply because those alive at that time were working with different challenges. So this hypothetical greater identity also chooses to be born in different time periods, historically speaking, and the same pattern appears in which counterparts are born as individuals, each biologically and spiritually connected, but with greater intertwinings and variations, as with a physical family tree. That's kind of funny, Seth saying that. Sometimes I get the impression that I would have been happier had I been born, like, I don't know, hundreds of years ago, or at like a simpler time, essentially. Not one where we have all of this modern technology that has completely changed the way we live our lives. Some people might wonder, how can I say that when technology has in so many ways arguably improved our lives? Well, I don't dispute that, and I certainly enjoy technology a lot. In fact, I'm using it right now, obviously, but there have been times where I've gotten the sense that, like, I'm supposed to live an epic life. I'm supposed to be some kind of warrior, even if only a spiritual warrior, but a warrior nonetheless, and I feel like it's almost impossible to do that in the modern era because it's like now instead of being able to grow my own food or being able to like build my own house and provide for myself and like live off the land and like even like make money in a much more this is the work that I've done, like let me sell this, or this is the simple obvious work I've done for so and so, let me get paid. Instead of that, it's all of this like this modern world, with credit cards and ATMs and interest rates and grocery stores where we get our food rather than growing it off the land. So I mean, sorry, what do you want me to say? There's an aspect of me that doesn't. There's an aspect of me that would prefer that, just as there's an aspect of me that prefers this, the modern era. There's an aspect of me that would prefer living like hundreds of years ago, or at least during a much simpler time, and there's an aspect of me that prefers what we have now. So there you go. That's the reality. It's like, I'm a Capricorn. The fuck do you expect? All right, where were we? Maybe there are other like offshoots of me then that are living hundreds of years ago and like living out their lives right now. Maybe that's why I feel that way. It's also kind of scary though, because back then you had to face things that, from our perspective, for most people anyway, would be terrifying now. Like, being mauled by some powerful predatory animal, like having to deal with who knows what. Anyway, let us continue. In its way, then, each century has its own integrity at all levels. The identity of each living person is always, quote-unquote, brand new. Yet its rich psychic heritage connects it through memory and experience to those who will, quote-unquote, come after, or those who have, quote-unquote, gone before. You are closer to some family members than others, and you are closer to some counterparts than others. Your parents have physical representations of their memories in terms of photos and letters. But take your break. 1127 to 1138. Now, those memories are not yours, and yet they are a very definite part of your heritage. In some cases, your parents might tell you about events that happened in your own early childhood that you have forgotten. In a strange way, however, these are not underlined your memories, but those of your parents about you. You take it on faith that particular events occurred even though you do not recall them. New paragraph. Those incidents are recorded unconsciously, however, if they applied to your direct experience, and under hypnosis, for example, you could make them your own. So there are different kinds of memories. You share certain biological similarities with your parents, but there are other biological groupings not understood, uniting counterparts in any given century. Organ transplants, for example, could be accepted more easily from counterparts, so that you have a kind of inner subspecies, or subfamily if you prefer, that operates within the regular physical divisions that you recognize. Telepathic messages flash more quickly from one counterpart to another. Give us a moment. Some of your counterparts' memories may appear in your dream states, where they show up as fantasies, perhaps, to you. A 1-minute pause at 11:48. Wait a minute, let me take some of this information in more. Telepathic messages flash more quickly from one counterpart to another. Some of your counterparts' memories may appear in your dream states, where they show up as fantasies, perhaps, to you. That's crazy. It's like what I was saying during the last video, this idea of what if our dreams are windows into realities that we essentially have lived or will live or are living or whatever. It's pretty wild to consider. A 1-minute pause at 11:48. These are like psychic snapshots rather than physical ones, involving instances that are a part of your heritage, yours, but, underlined, not yours. They add to what you are. They can give you correct information about the quote-unquote past, even as your parents' photographs can tell you about a time in which you did not directly participate in your terms. The old photographs will strike a chord within you, however, and so will the psychic memories. Pause. You are always at the center of your life. Again, your being as you understand it is never annihilated, but continues to develop its own existence in other ways. A portion of you has lived many lives upon this planet, but the quote-unquote you that you know is freshly here, and will never again encounter space and time in precisely the same way. The same applies to each life lived before. The same applies to each life either... Can't say this sentence correctly. The same applies to each life lived either before or after. Biologically, you rest upon a heritage, however, and psychically the same applies. The soul, or this greater personage, does not simply send out an old self in new clothes time and time again, humorously, but each time a new, freshly minted self that then develops and goes its own way, with much emphasis. That self rides, underlined, firmly, however, in the great flight of experience, and feels within itself all of those other fully unique versions that also fling their way into existence. So you, Joseph, were Nabeen, and the black woman, and the Roman soldier, and yet you were none of those. Footnote. See the 721st session, as well as Note 11 for Appendix 22. End of footnote. But their realities are also a part of your own greater underlined alliance. Now, your friend Peter, Smith, shared the same earthly period. Footnote. See Appendix 22. End of footnote. You are not counterparts, or you underlined are not counterparts, but closely enough allied so that in certain terms you quote-unquote share some of the same psychic memories, like cousins who speak about old, dimly remembered brothers. However, there are no coincidences in underlined any groupings, biological or psychic or social. It is obvious that certain interests bring people together in any club meeting or gathering, period. There are reasons, then, why people are born in any given century, and why they meet in space and time. So there are reasons why you and Peter met, and why certain people come to Rupert's classes. End of that material for now. 12:05. After adding a few sentences of personal information for Jane, Seth ended the session at 12:07 a.m. Jane had experienced internal images while delivering some of the book material, yet hadn't been able to get them clearly. One image had to do with an analogy involving plants and counterparts, she said. In it, the leaves of the plants quote-unquote gave out messages as counterparts did, but she couldn't elaborate upon this verbally. The next morning Jane told me that she'd been, quote, getting stuff all night again, end quote, on Unknown Reality. As they have rather often recently, the phenomena had persisted in varying forms through her sleeping and waking states. They had been very creative phenomena, though. After breakfast, Jane enthusiastically set to work writing about her new ideas. She plans to use them in psychic politics. Here I can barely touch upon a couple of examples of what she experienced throughout the night, and wrote about today. She may revise her copy somewhat before it appears in Politics, but I prefer to quote from her original notes. I'm beginning to think I should have had coffee today instead of green tea, because it's like, as I near the end of this cup of green tea, I find myself getting sleepy, and it's like it's just not strong enough. Oh well. 1. While asleep, she'd been aware of many insights about receiving Seth material in that mode, some of it, quote, at a preliminary stage before it's ready, end quote. But all of it came through in a peculiar way, Jane continued. Quote, as if I were equipped with mental earphones. This material is somehow being transmitted directly onto my brainwaves, automatically, yet in a wild way without disturbing my own thinking. So is a different part of the brain being impressed than the part with which I do my usual thinking? Interesting, end quote. She went on to develop an analogy involving two lines of music that eventually come together into one melody. Footnote. Jane used an imaginary musical analogy in describing her sleep state experience with mental earphones. But here are two psychic events of hers that can serve as real-life analogies. 1. Her reception 10 months ago, while asleep, of multidimensional data from Seth, which she followed the next day with her own material on neurological pulses. See Appendix 4 in Volume 1. 2. Her hearing Seth's thunderous voice in her sleep 2 months ago, as described in the opening notes for the 710th session. End of footnote. 2. Once Jane woke up, she had the idea of, quote, counterparts and four-fronted selves, end quote, in mind. As she wrote today, quote, there might be four counterparts alive in one general time period, a century, for example. These form a psychic quote-unquote block, and any of the four can pick up information from this joint pool of identity. Each person is distinct, yet each is an added dimension of the others, so that on different levels the four, in this case, create an alliance and become a four-fronted counterpart self, covering a given century. This is a quote-unquote working alliance that exists in potential form always, but the four-fronted counterpart self's own sense of continuity is not broken up. It persists outside of space and time, while its parts, the individual selves or counterparts, live in space and time. Footnote. A note added a few days later. In revised form, Jane did soon discuss her material on counterparts and four-fronted selves in politics. See Chapter 12. End of footnote. Now for two concluding paragraphs of commentary and reference. Jane's statement that the four-fronted counterpart self persists outside of space and time implies a contradiction, of course, but this situation is one that we, as physical creatures, will in some manner always have to contend with when we encounter certain of Jane's and Seth's concepts, including that of the four-fronted counterpart self. Seth's own idea of simultaneous time, that all exists at once, yet is not completed, has run throughout his material since its inception over a decade ago. As he quite humorously commented in the 14th session for January 8th, 1964, for you have no idea of the difficulties involved in explaining time to someone who must take time to understand the explanation. Yet Seth's simultaneous time isn't an absolute, for, as he also told us in that session, while I am not affected by time on your plane, I am affected by something resembling time on my plane. To me, time can be manipulated, used at leisure and examined. To me, your time is a vehicle, one of several by which I can enter your awareness. Underlined, it is therefore still a reality of some kind to me. My emphasis. Otherwise I could not utilize it in any way whatsoever. End quote. Footnote. Because I think they contain some of Seth's most basic information, I also presented these quotations from the 14th session in my introductory notes for Volume 1. Additional material from the 14th session can be found in Appendix 13 in Volume 2 and its Note 4. Then, and that is the end of the footnote, by the way. Sometimes this app confuses me a little bit. Then, in the 44th session for April 15th, 1964, Seth explained that in the inner universe, quote, energy transformation and value fulfillment, both existing within the spacious present, or at once, add up to a durability that is at the same time spontaneous and simultaneous, end quote. The durability being achieved through constant expansion in terms of value fulfillment. Footnote. For more thinking along these lines, I suggest the reader see the longer excerpts from the 44th session in Appendix 12, and also Chapter 18 of the Seth material. End of footnote, and end of session. Alright, so at 1 hour and 11 minutes in, it looks like that is it for our material today. So I hope you enjoyed. I'm going to take a couple sips of tea and then actually look at what we will cover next time, a little preview of that, and then have some closing comments. I thought I might as well just finish it. Alright, so looking at what we will cover next time when we pick up with session 725, let us see. Psychic blueprints and the arithmetic of consciousness, the eating of meat and Earth's creativity. And then session 726, the island analogy, more on counterparts. And it will then be at that point that we begin section 6 of the book, entitled Reincarnation and Counterparts, the quote-unquote past seen through the mosaics of consciousness. Well, that will be interesting, I'm sure. Alright, so I want to thank you guys for watching this. I hope you enjoyed. I'm glad that there continues to be a small audience, not very many people, but a small audience for these videos, people who seem to enjoy them. I'm glad about that because I know I certainly do. I love this kind of information. I could just do this endlessly, basically, it feels like. So, thank you for being here. I guess I don't really have too many closing comments, just that I look forward to resuming next time with more of our Seth book analysis. So thanks for watching, and bye for now.